Pelican Bay Prison, the brutal truth behind the walls. The riot nobody could forget. The sound of steel doors slammed shut. Then came the silence, broken only by screams echoing through the concrete walls. Inside Pelican Bay Prison's notorious SHU, the Security Housing Unit, hundreds of inmates were locked inside small, windowless cells. But on this day, silence didn't last. A fight broke out in the yard. Within seconds it spread like wildfire. Rival gang members, armed with homemade weapons, turned the dusty ground into a battlefield. Guards fired warning shots, but no one stopped. The riot was so violent that even correctional officers admitted they lost control. This was not just a prison fight. It was proof that Pelican Bay was built to crush men, but inside, gangs still found ways to rule. And here's the shocking truth. What you're about to hear is only the beginning. The birth of Pelican Bay. When Pelican Bay opened in 1989, the state of California made a promise. This would be the prison to end all prison gangs. Unlike older prisons, Pelican Bay was built with one terrifying idea: total isolation. The prison is split into two main sections. A general population yard where inmates could move, eat, and work under watchful eyes. And the SHU, the Security Housing Unit, a block of windowless, soundless concrete cells designed to hold the most dangerous prisoners for years, even decades. Inside the SHU, inmates spent 23 hours a day in their cells. No phone calls. No physical contact. The only human interaction was a tray sliding through a steel slot. At first, prison officials believed this would break the gangs. But they underestimated their enemy. From the very beginning, gang leaders treated the SHU not as a punishment, but as their headquarters. They used coded letters, messages hidden under stamps, and even whispered signals through air vents to pass orders. What California thought would destroy gangs ended up giving them a new kind of power. And when one correctional officer was stabbed in the arm during a surprise ambush inside the SHU corridor, it became clear Pelican Bay wasn't breaking gangs. It was feeding them. Life in the SHU. Imagine living in a space no bigger than a small bathroom. 4 walls, no windows, no sunlight. That's the SHU cell, 8 feet by 10 feet. Inside, men went years without touching another human being. They ate alone, exercised alone, and thought alone. Some tried to cope. They did push-ups until their arms shook. They counted cracks in the concrete. They memorized the pattern of the ceiling. A few even created chess pieces from chewed bread. But the silence did things to people. They started hearing voices that weren't there. They would scream for hours into the concrete, only to hear their own echo. One inmate described it as being buried alive in a coffin you can't climb out of. Still, gang leaders thrived. Even locked in those boxes, they found ways to rule. And whenever prisoners were released into the small dog-run yard, concrete pens barely big enough for pacing, blood could spill. One afternoon, 2 rival gang members, both shackled at the waist, still managed to turn their chains into weapons. By the time guards fired rubber bullets, one man was down on the ground, bleeding into the concrete. Pelican Bay wasn't just about confinement. It was about survival. The hidden war between inmates and guards. Pelican Bay wasn't only inmate versus inmate. It was inmate versus officer, every single day. Guards carried pepper spray, batons, and riot guns, but many admitted they worked in constant fear. Gangs studied their routines. They knew which officer walked which tier and at what time. Some prisoners would smear soap on the floor to make guards slip during searches. Others hid weapons in their cells, ready for the moment of opportunity. Every time an alarm went off, officers sprinted toward chaos, never sure if they would walk out unharmed. The SHU was supposed to protect them, but the food slots became weapons. Inmates could reach through, stabbing or throwing liquids on guards. In one case, a sharpened piece of metal shot out of a slot so quickly that a guard barely pulled back in time. Lockdowns became routine. Entire blocks shut down for weeks, with no movement, no yard, no visits. But even then, tension simmered. And when a correctional officer was attacked in the dining hall during what should have been a routine meal shift, the message was clear. No one had control inside Pelican Bay, not even the guards. The human cost. While the prison tried to keep order, the men inside were slowly breaking down. Psychologists warned that long-term solitary confinement causes permanent damage. Prisoners became paranoid. They forgot how to talk to other humans. Some stopped recognizing their own reflection in the mirror. Families on the outside were torn apart. Mothers drove 12 hours to Crescent City just for a visit, only to sit behind thick glass, speaking to their sons through a static-filled phone. Some broke down in tears, unable to touch their own child. But inside, the gangs never cared. They pulled in young men, promising protection in exchange for loyalty. Refusing often meant violence. One night, an inmate who refused to follow orders was dragged into a cell. By the time guards arrived, it was too late. His body was left as a warning: inside Pelican Bay, you obey, or you pay the price. The day of reckoning. By the 1990s, Pelican Bay had earned a reputation across the world. It wasn't just a prison. It was a machine built to crush men's spirits. But the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. Journalists began reporting on the abuses inside. Lawsuits piled up. Former inmates testified about beatings, starvation diets, and years in solitary with no end date. One of the most famous cases exposed how inmates were kept in the SHU indefinitely, sometimes based only on a drawing or rumor linking them to a gang. Some had no violent record but were still buried in concrete boxes for decades. The public was shocked. Human rights groups called Pelican Bay a violation of basic dignity. But even as the world learned the truth, violence inside continued. On one fateful day, a full-scale riot erupted across multiple yards at once. Homemade weapons clashed against batons. Blood stained the ground. Dozens were injured, guards and inmates alike. The truth behind the walls of Pelican Bay could no longer be denied. This was not just a prison. It was a battlefield. The walls that watch. Pelican Bay wasn't just built with concrete, it was built with fear. The prison's architecture itself was a weapon. The cells in the SHU were designed with blind corners, so inmates couldn't see when guards approached. Surveillance cameras watched every move. Floodlights kept the yards glowing at night, so darkness never offered protection. For inmates, it felt like the walls themselves were alive, always watching, always listening. But even under that constant gaze, prisoners adapted. They learned the exact moment the cameras panned. They slipped notes under doors in the brief seconds blind spots appeared. They even created fishing lines by tying string to toothpaste tubes and sliding them under doors, passing messages from cell to cell. This silent war of strategy played out every day. Still, sometimes silence turned into violence. In one shocking incident, during a routine escort, an inmate slipped his cuffs forward, attacked an officer, and nearly started a full-blown riot in the corridor. The walls may have been watching, but they couldn't always stop what was coming. Psychological warfare. The SHU wasn't just physical punishment, it was psychological warfare. Prisoners described days blurring into weeks, weeks into years. Without clocks or sunlight, time lost all meaning. Some men started talking to themselves. Others carved messages into the concrete to prove they existed. A few broke completely, banging on the steel doors until their hands bled. But the gangs understood the power of the mind. They used isolation as a weapon too. If a member betrayed them, he might be targeted for a silent treatment, ignored by every inmate around him until he begged to belong again. Prison officials tried to use psychology too. They offered inmates the chance to leave the SHU, if they gave up information about their gang. But debriefing, as it was called, was often a death sentence. Anyone labeled a snitch could be targeted the moment they returned to general population. And when one debriefing inmate was stabbed in the yard less than 48 hours after leaving solitary, it sent a message to everyone: silence was safer than freedom. End of chapter on extreme event, debriefed inmate murdered after release from SHU. Control by force. When psychology failed, Pelican Bay relied on raw force. Guards were trained to move in formations, shields up, batons ready. Whenever a fight broke out, they would storm in, pepper spray flooding the air, rubber bullets cracking like thunder. But force didn't always mean victory. Many inmates grew used to the sting of pepper spray. Some wore layers of wet clothing during yard fights to shield themselves from bullets. The cycle became predictable: lockdowns, searches, confiscations. Then weeks later, weapons would reappear, hidden in ceiling tiles or hollowed-out shoes. Officers began to see themselves not as keepers of order, but as soldiers in a war with no end. Some admitted they dreaded going to work, knowing that today could be the day they wouldn't come home. And then came the day when guards opened a cell door during a routine extraction, and were met with a flood of boiling liquid flung into their faces. 2 officers were hospitalized. It was a chilling reminder. Inside Pelican Bay, even routine actions could explode into violence. The lawsuit that shook Pelican Bay. By the mid-1990s, Pelican Bay's secrets were leaking into the outside world. Former inmates described beatings, deprivation, and decades of solitary confinement with no sunlight. Families protested. Human rights groups launched investigations. Finally, in 1995, a landmark lawsuit, Madrid versus Gomez, dragged Pelican Bay into federal court. The trial exposed shocking evidence. Guards accused of excessive force, prisoners held in the SHU for suspected gang ties without solid proof, and mentally ill inmates locked in solitary cells until they deteriorated beyond recognition. The judge's ruling was damning. He declared that conditions in the SHU violated the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. Changes were ordered. Oversight was promised. But inside Pelican Bay, change came slowly. Guards tightened their grip and gangs dug in deeper. Some inmates were released from solitary, but others remained buried in concrete, forgotten by time. And as if to prove that no court ruling could tame the prison, violence erupted just weeks after the judgment. A yard riot so fierce it left multiple men bleeding on the ground, while sirens wailed and smoke filled the air. The endless cycle. Years passed. Reforms were promised, protests held, policies rewritten. But the cycle inside Pelican Bay never truly ended. Inmates still woke up in concrete coffins, staring at blank walls. Guards still walked the tiers, knowing each step could spark an ambush. Families still drove hours for visits, praying their loved ones would survive another week. The SHU became a symbol, not just of Pelican Bay, but of America's debate over punishment and human rights. Was it justice? Or was it torture? And yet, through all the debates, one truth never changed. Pelican Bay remained a place where survival meant more than rehabilitation. Where violence was never far away. Where men lived, and sometimes died, behind walls built to break them. And on one cold morning, when a full-scale yard riot once again sent dozens to the hospital, it became clear. The brutal truth behind the walls of Pelican Bay was that nothing ever really changed. Inside the yard. The yard at Pelican Bay was unlike any other prison yard in America. There were no basketball courts, no grassy fields, no space to run. Instead, men were placed into small, concrete enclosures. Bare pens surrounded by walls so high you couldn't even see the horizon. These yards were nicknamed dog runs because they looked more like kennels than exercise spaces. Inside, inmates paced back and forth, staring at the sky through a thin slice of metal grating. For many, this was the only sunlight they saw all year. Some stood with their faces pressed to the bars, trying to feel the warmth on their skin. Others used the time to work out, dropping to the ground for push-ups or shadowboxing to keep their bodies alive. But the yard was also where tensions boiled. Men who hadn't seen each other in months were suddenly face to face again. Rivalries reignited. Messages were passed. And sometimes, grudges turned violent. Guards stationed above watched with rifles ready, knowing that at any second, the quiet pacing could turn into chaos. For the inmates, the yard wasn't freedom. It was just another cage, only bigger. The language of survival. Life inside Pelican Bay created its own language, a way of surviving when words were banned or punished. Inmates tapped messages through the plumbing system, turning pipes into a hidden telephone line. They passed kites, tiny notes written on scraps of paper rolled tightly and slipped under doors. Some even learned to flick toothpaste tubes tied to string across the floor, fishing information from one cell to the next. These secret methods kept the prison gangs alive. Orders for assaults, drug deals, or even peace treaties could move silently across blocks, beyond the reach of guards. But the language wasn't just for crime. Prisoners also used it to cling to their humanity. One man taught his neighbor Spanish through the vents. Another shared prayers, whispered late at night when the block was quiet. For some, this code was the only thing that reminded them they weren't completely alone. Survival inside Pelican Bay wasn't only about strength. It was about communication and the power of words, even when spoken in whispers or tapped in code. Families on the outside. While men suffered behind Pelican Bay's walls, their families lived a different kind of sentence. To visit, many had to drive 10 or 12 hours to Crescent City, a remote town near the Oregon border. Some families slept in their cars or cheap motels because they couldn't afford the trip otherwise. Mothers, sisters, children, all waited in long lines only to see their loved one through thick glass, separated by phones that crackled with static. For young children, the visits were confusing. They were told their father couldn't come home yet, but they didn't understand why they couldn't hug him. Tears were common. So were broken families. Some wives left, unable to handle years of absence. Some parents grew old on the outside, dying before their sons ever left solitary. Letters became the only lifeline. For the families, Pelican Bay was a prison too, one made of distance, money, and heartbreak. The toll on the mind. Psychologists who studied Pelican Bay's SHU described the same thing again and again. Solitary confinement breaks the human mind. Prisoners who entered with no history of mental illness often developed paranoia, hallucinations, or depression after years in isolation. Some talked to imaginary people. Others screamed at night, convinced something was crawling on their skin. Without normal human interaction, the brain begins to starve. The silence becomes unbearable. The walls seem to close in. Time itself feels broken. One former inmate described it as living inside a concrete coffin, where you begin to wonder if you're already dead. The guards saw the breakdown too. Some men stopped speaking. Others mutilated themselves just to feel something real. Mental health staff were often overwhelmed, unable to treat so many cases. Pelican Bay wasn't just punishing the body. It was crushing the mind, and in many cases the damage was permanent. The hunger strikes. By the 2010s, the men inside Pelican Bay had reached a breaking point. They felt the world had forgotten them, buried alive in solitary for decades with no end date. So they used the only weapon left to them, their own bodies. In 2011, more than 6,000 inmates across California joined a hunger strike led by Pelican Bay prisoners. They refused food, demanding changes to solitary confinement policies. They wanted fair hearings, limits on isolation, and the chance to return to general population if they stayed discipline-free. The hunger strike gained international attention. Human rights groups, news outlets, and activists put pressure on the state. Families rallied outside the prison, holding signs and chanting the names of their loved ones. Inside, men grew weak, some collapsing in their cells. Medical teams monitored them, but many refused care. For them, starvation was better than endless silence. The hunger strikes didn't end solitary, but they sparked change. California eventually reduced its use of the SHU, releasing some long-term prisoners back into less restrictive housing. For the first time in decades, cracks appeared in Pelican Bay's walls, not physical cracks but cracks in the system itself. The cracks in the system. By the time the hunger strikes reached the world's headlines, Pelican Bay had become more than just a prison. It was a symbol of America's prison crisis. Lawyers argued that keeping men in solitary for decades was not just punishment but torture. Civil rights groups released reports, describing how inmates were placed in the SHU not for violent acts, but sometimes for drawings, tattoos, or even books that officials claimed proved gang ties. These revelations shook the public. People who had never thought about prison suddenly asked, how long can a human being survive like this? The state of California was under pressure. Politicians who once supported the SHU now had to answer to families, activists, and international observers. Courts began demanding reforms. Slowly, the system that once seemed unbreakable started to show weakness. And for the first time in years, some men walked out of solitary and back into general population. The cracks were real, but the fight was far from over. The stories of survival. Behind every locked door at Pelican Bay, there was a story. One man survived 25 years in solitary by memorizing every line of the Bible. Another drew entire murals on his cell walls using soap and coffee. Some wrote letters that never reached their families but gave them hope to keep breathing one more day. These stories of survival spread beyond the walls. Former inmates described how they counted footsteps, sang to themselves, or created invisible friends just to hold on to sanity. But survival had a cost. Many who left Pelican Bay's SHU stepped back into the world with scars no one could see. They jumped at sudden noises. They struggled to hold conversations. They walked through cities overwhelmed by the simple freedom of open space. The stories of survival proved one thing. The human spirit can endure, but it never comes out unchanged. The cost to the guards. It wasn't only inmates who paid the price. The guards who worked at Pelican Bay carried scars of their own. They lived in constant tension, knowing that a quiet shift could explode without warning. Many developed stress disorders, unable to sleep or relax even after they went home. Some struggled with drinking, others left the job entirely, broken by years of fear and violence. In Crescent City, the town that depended on Pelican Bay for jobs, this created a strange reality. Guards were both respected and feared. They patrolled the same grocery stores and schools as the families of inmates. Lines blurred. The prison swallowed the whole community. For guards, Pelican Bay was not just a workplace. It was a battlefield that followed them home, shaping their lives long after they hung up the uniform. Reform and resistance. As the lawsuits and hunger strikes forced California to rethink solitary confinement, changes began to roll out. Thousands of men were reviewed, and many who had spent decades in the SHU were transferred back into general population. The state announced new rules. Solitary would no longer be indefinite. To be placed in the SHU, inmates had to commit actual violent acts, not just be accused of gang membership. For some, this was a victory. Families reunited. Men who hadn't touched grass in years finally stepped into open yards. But not everyone saw it as progress. Guards argued the reforms made prisons more dangerous, claiming gangs would regain power. Some inmates also feared leaving solitary. After so many years in isolation, the idea of crowds, noise, and exposure felt terrifying. Reform gave hope, but it also revealed the deep wounds Pelican Bay had carved into everyone who lived or worked inside. The legacy of Pelican Bay. Today, Pelican Bay remains one of the most infamous prisons in America. Its name is a warning, a symbol of punishment so severe it captured the world's attention. For some, it represents justice, the place where the most dangerous men were sent, never to harm society again. For others, it stands as a stain on the justice system, proof that punishment crossed the line into cruelty. What cannot be denied is the legacy it leaves behind. Thousands of lives changed forever, families torn apart, communities scarred, and a nation forced to question how far it is willing to go in the name of security. The brutal truth behind the walls of Pelican Bay is not just about violence or control. It is about what happens when a system decides that breaking the mind is an acceptable form of justice. And even though reforms have come, the shadow of Pelican Bay's SHU still lingers, a reminder of a place where silence, isolation, and fear ruled for decades. The town that lives in the prison's shadow. Crescent City, California, is a small town surrounded by forests and coastline. To outsiders it looks peaceful. But for locals, life has always been tied to Pelican Bay. When the prison opened, it brought jobs, steady paychecks in a region with few opportunities. Correctional officers, nurses, cooks, and maintenance crews all relied on it. Families moved in, schools expanded, and businesses grew. But the shadow of the prison stretched everywhere. Conversations in diners often turned to lockdowns or riots. Children grew up hearing about gangs and solitary confinement before they even understood what those words meant. Some kids dreamed of leaving town, while others followed their parents into prison jobs, keeping the cycle alive. Crescent City became known not for its beauty, but for its prison. And in many ways, the town was just as locked into Pelican Bay's story as the inmates themselves. The cycle of violence. The prison system was built on a cycle. Violence leads to punishment, punishment breeds more violence, and the wheel keeps turning. Inmates sent to Pelican Bay often arrived already hardened by years in other prisons. The SHU was meant to strip away their power, but instead, it became a pressure cooker. Every act of resistance, every fight, every coded message, led to more isolation. And more isolation led to more anger. Some inmates spent decades in this loop, never seeing a way out. Young men who entered in their 20s grew old in those cells, their lives measured not by years, but by lockdowns and yard recalls. Even when reforms came, the scars remained. Violence had become part of the prison's rhythm, a drumbeat that echoed through the halls, reminding everyone that Pelican Bay was built to punish, not to heal. The forgotten prisoners. For every story of reform, there were men who slipped through the cracks. Prisoners who spent decades in solitary and were forgotten by the outside world. Some had no family left to visit them. Others never wrote letters because they didn't know if anyone would answer. Their names rarely appeared in lawsuits or news stories. They were ghosts living inside concrete walls. Guards sometimes spoke of these men with unease. Those who barely spoke, who shuffled silently to the shower, who stared blankly through the slots of their doors. These prisoners weren't violent anymore. They were simply broken. The brutal truth behind Pelican Bay wasn't only about riots or gangs. It was about the quiet destruction of men who disappeared, not because of death but because of neglect. The public awakening. By the mid-2010s, Pelican Bay had become a national conversation. Documentaries, newspaper investigations, and human rights campaigns brought the stories of solitary confinement into homes across America. Suddenly, people who had never thought about prisons began asking questions. Should anyone spend 20 years in a cell without sunlight? Can justice truly exist when the punishment erases a person's humanity? California responded with reforms, and other states began re-evaluating their own solitary confinement policies. Pelican Bay became a case study, a warning of what happens when punishment goes unchecked. Yet even as the world turned its eyes to Crescent City, the prison walls stood tall. For the men inside, daily life continued. Cold meals, small cells, long silences. Change came slowly and not everyone lived long enough to see it. The men who came home. Some prisoners eventually walked out of Pelican Bay, stepping back into a world that had moved on without them. For those who spent decades in the SHU, freedom was overwhelming. The sound of traffic was deafening. The sight of open skies made them dizzy. Simple things like using a phone or standing in a supermarket aisle felt impossible. Many struggled to reconnect with family. Children had grown into adults. Parents had passed away. Relationships couldn't be rebuilt overnight. Some former inmates spoke about missing the routine of prison, the strange comfort of knowing exactly what each day would bring. Others carried the mental scars, nightmares, paranoia, and inability to trust. Pelican Bay didn't just take years from them. It reshaped who they were forever. Inside the mind of power. Even with reforms, one question lingered: how had gangs maintained control for so long inside Pelican Bay? The answer was fear and loyalty. Leaders issued orders that stretched across states, from solitary cells to street corners in Los Angeles. Associates followed those commands, knowing that disobedience meant punishment, even death. But it wasn't only about violence. Gangs provided identity, purpose, and a twisted form of protection. In a world where trust was rare, belonging to something, even something dangerous, gave inmates a reason to keep going. Pelican Bay tried to break this system, but by locking leaders away, it also gave them mythic status. The men in the SHU became legends, their voices carrying weight even when spoken through air vents and scraps of paper. The mind of power at Pelican Bay wasn't built on strength alone. It was built on fear, respect, and the belief that survival depended on allegiance. The cost to society. The story of Pelican Bay isn't trapped behind its walls, it spills out into the world beyond. Families lost providers. Communities lost fathers, brothers, and sons. Taxpayers poured billions into maintaining a system that many believed made society no safer. Studies showed that men released from long-term solitary often re-entered the world unprepared, traumatized, and more likely to struggle with mental health or crime. The prison's methods didn't always break cycles. It sometimes reinforced them. Pelican Bay raised a painful question. Did this level of punishment protect society, or did it simply create more broken lives, spilling pain from inside the walls into the outside world? The turning point. By the late 2010s, Pelican Bay stood at a crossroads. The hunger strikes had forced California to make changes, and thousands of inmates once buried in solitary were moved back into less restrictive housing. The SHU, once the centerpiece of Pelican Bay, was slowly being emptied. Some blocks were shuttered, their echoing hallways left silent. For the first time since 1989, the idea that Pelican Bay could operate without mass solitary confinement seemed possible. But the shift was not without tension. Guards feared that gang leaders, once isolated, would regain influence. Inmates feared retaliation for years of resistance. The balance of power was delicate, and everyone knew it could tip at any moment. Still, the change was historic. The walls had not fallen, but the rules that defined life inside them had begun to bend. The human rights battle. Pelican Bay became a symbol in the global fight against solitary confinement. Human rights organizations compared the SHU to torture chambers, while prison officials defended it as a necessary tool for control. Debates raged in newspapers, on television, and in courtrooms. Could a democracy justify locking people in windowless rooms for decades? Did public safety outweigh the damage to human minds? Former inmates testified before lawmakers, their voices shaking as they described years without sunlight. Families stood beside them, holding photographs of loved ones still inside. The battle wasn't just about Pelican Bay, it was about the future of punishment itself. And every reform made in Crescent City echoed far beyond California's borders. Echoes of silence. Even as reforms rolled out, the silence of Pelican Bay lingered. Men who had left the SHU carried it with them like a shadow. They described hearing the hum of fluorescent lights even in their sleep. They struggled to stand in crowds, overwhelmed by noise. Some said they missed the structure of confinement, even while hating the memory of it. The silence had carved itself into them, reshaping who they were. For many, freedom was not an escape. It was another kind of sentence, one where the walls existed inside their own minds. The echoes of Pelican Bay proved that punishment doesn't end at release. It follows you quietly forever. The prison today. Today, Pelican Bay remains open. The SHU is no longer filled to capacity, and many of the men once trapped in indefinite isolation now live in general population units. But the prison still carries its reputation. Guards remain cautious. Inmates still whisper about the old days of silence and control. Crescent City still lives in the shadow of the massive gray walls. For some, Pelican Bay has softened, less violent, less oppressive than before. For others, the legacy remains unchanged. The name itself still sparks fear. Walking through its corridors today, you still feel the weight of history. The locked doors, the sterile cells, the watchtowers staring down. It's a reminder that Pelican Bay was built not for rehabilitation but for containment. And no amount of reform can erase that truth. The brutal truth. When Pelican Bay was built, it was meant to break the power of gangs. Instead, it broke men. It created a world where silence was punishment, where families were torn apart, where guards carried their trauma home, and where society itself questioned what justice really meant. The brutal truth behind the walls is not just about the violence that happened inside. It's about the cost, human, emotional, financial, that rippled outward. Pelican Bay is a place where survival became the only goal. Where concrete walls were designed to erase people, and yet, their voices still found ways to reach the world. And even today, as the SHU stands partly empty, the shadow of Pelican Bay continues to loom, not only over those who lived there, but over all of us who must decide what justice really looks like. Isolation as a weapon. At Pelican Bay, isolation wasn't just a punishment, it was a strategy. Administrators believed that by cutting prisoners off from each other, gangs would collapse. But what they didn't count on was how resourceful human beings can be. The very walls meant to silence them became tools. Through vents, through pipes, through the tapping of fists, prisoners built invisible networks. Orders were passed, friendships were formed, and sometimes, wars were declared, all from cells that were never supposed to allow a whisper. Isolation didn't end power, it reshaped it. The SHU became a throne room for leaders who learned how to rule without ever leaving their concrete boxes. The weight of time. Time at Pelican Bay was its own kind of torment. Days didn't pass in the usual way. With no clocks, no sunlight, and no real sense of movement, hours stretched endlessly. Some men marked days by scratching lines into the wall. Others counted the meals. 3 trays meant another 24 hours survived. But the years were heavier. Birthdays came and went. Entire decades slipped by. Men watched their hair turn gray in mirrors that reflected faces they barely recognized. Outside, the world moved forward. Technology, music, politics, everything, but inside Pelican Bay time stood still. For those trapped in the SHU, it felt like the world had ended, and they were the last ones left alive. The anatomy of fear. Fear was everywhere in Pelican Bay. The guards feared riots that could explode without warning. The inmates feared betrayal from the men in the cells beside them. Families feared phone calls that brought bad news. Even the building itself radiated fear. The heavy gates, the razor wire, the gun towers, it was a place designed to remind everyone inside that escape was impossible, that control was absolute. Fear became routine. It was as normal as the clanging of metal doors or the echo of boots on the tier. But living in constant fear does something to the mind. It sharpens instincts, but it also corrodes trust. And in Pelican Bay, trust was the most dangerous thing of all. The prisoner's code. Inside Pelican Bay, survival depended on an unwritten code. You didn't snitch. You didn't betray your people. You stood by your gang even when it meant decades in solitary. Breaking the code meant being marked, and being marked meant living every day knowing violence could come for you. Some men followed the code out of fear. Others out of loyalty. A few believed it was the only way to have meaning in a place where everything else was stripped away. The prisoner's code kept order, but it also kept chains locked tighter than steel ever could. For many, the code was the reason they survived, but it was also the reason they never escaped Pelican Bay's grip. The guards' code. The guards had a code too. They relied on each other like soldiers in a war zone. When alarms sounded, they moved as one, knowing hesitation could mean injury or worse. They didn't always trust the administration above them, but on the tier, trust between officers was sacred. Over time, many guards became hardened. They stopped seeing inmates as people and started seeing them only as threats. Others tried to hold on to empathy, but it was difficult in a place where kindness could be seen as weakness. The guards' code was built on survival too. Not just survival of the body, but survival of the mind in a job that tested every part of it. The prison without end. For some men, Pelican Bay was not a chapter in their life. It was their entire story. They arrived young and they grew old inside its walls. Some died there, their names barely remembered outside of official paperwork. For these men, Pelican Bay wasn't just a prison. It was the only world they ever knew. The outside world became a dream, something they heard about in whispers or saw in fading photographs. Families stopped visiting. Letters stopped coming. Eventually, they stopped expecting freedom. Pelican Bay turned life sentences into something heavier, a kind of existence where days blended into each other, and hope became harder to hold on to than anything else. The debate over justice. Pelican Bay forced America to confront an uncomfortable question. What is justice? Is it keeping the most dangerous men away from society at any cost? Or is it finding a balance between punishment and humanity? Supporters argued that Pelican Bay kept California safer by isolating gang leaders who could order killings even from prison yards. Critics countered that locking men in small boxes for decades did more harm than good, not just to the prisoners but to society when they returned broken and unstable. The debate has never ended. Even now, Pelican Bay remains a case study for the limits of punishment, and a symbol of how far a nation will go in the name of control. The shadow of Pelican Bay. The story of Pelican Bay doesn't end at its gates. Its shadow stretches across California, across America, across every conversation about prisons and punishment. It shaped laws. It changed policies. It scarred families and communities. And it left thousands of men carrying its weight, whether inside its walls or outside trying to rebuild their lives. The prison still stands in Crescent City, gray and silent. But its shadow is louder than ever, a reminder that behind those walls, the line between justice and cruelty has always been razor thin. The final word. Pelican Bay Prison was built to crush gangs, but what it really crushed were men. For decades, it stood as a fortress of silence, where voices were buried in concrete, and time itself seemed to stop. Inside those walls, survival became the only goal. Inmates lived by codes of loyalty and fear. Guards patrolled like soldiers in an endless war. Families drove for hours just to see their loved ones through glass, knowing they could never touch them. The hunger strikes, the lawsuits, the reforms, each revealed the same truth. Pelican Bay was more than a prison. It was a mirror showing us how far a society is willing to go in the name of justice. Some call it necessary. Others call it torture. But everyone who hears the stories agrees, it left scars that will never fade. Today the SHU is no longer filled with men locked away for decades. Policies have changed. Lives have been reshaped. But the shadow of Pelican Bay remains, reaching beyond Crescent City, beyond California, into every conversation about crime, punishment, and humanity. Because the brutal truth behind the walls is this. Pelican Bay didn't just hold prisoners. It held a piece of America's conscience. And the question it leaves us with is one we must all answer. How much punishment is too much?